December the 8th, 1953 was the day that Samuel Burl Kinison, a comedic genius and legend in his own time, came screaming into the world. As a young boy, Sam idolized his father, Samuel Earl Kinison, who was a Pentecostal preacher. His father preached in churches all across the country, and when young Sam was only 3 years old, he was hit by a truck. Although it didn't kill him, it did leave him with mild brain damage. His mom and dad did the best they could to provide for Sam and his 2 brothers, Richard and Bill. By the time Sam had turned 11, his mother and father's relationship had soured, and they divorced soon after. Sam wanted very badly to live with his dad, with whom he looked up to, but only his brother Bill was allowed to go with the elder Sam. Young Sam and his brother Richard was granted custody to their mother. This angered Sam for 2 reasons. One was he wanted to follow in his father's footsteps and become a Pentecostal preacher just like his dad, but aside from that, he was a dad's boy who just wanted to spend time with him, and he felt like he had lost his father. In 1968, Sam started attending Bible training studies to continue in the path to become a Pentecostal preacher, just like his dad. For the next several years, he did just that. Recordings can still be found online today of Sam's preaching style, which was a very fire and brimstone style of preaching. His mother soon married another preacher, and Sam set out to do the best he could to follow in his father's footsteps. Soon, he was married and trying his best to support his new wife. He was having a very difficult time doing that on a preacher's salary. It wasn't long before his wife left him, and his father, with whom he idolized, died soon after. He became very depressed, and then became very angry at God, and dropped his preaching duties, and decided to try his hand at shock comedy, and aimed his ire at his marriage failure, and at God because he had blamed him for taking his father from him. Sam began spending a lot of time at the comedy club in Los Angeles, where he became friends with other up-and-coming celebrity comedians like Jim Carrey and Robin Williams. He had married and divorced again in the years that followed, and used that personal life tragedy, as well as religion, which he had denounced as material for his comedy set. By 1985, Sam had befriended the late Rodney Dangerfield, and was welcomed to appear on his 9th annual Young Comedians special. Later that same year, Rodney had even gotten him a small part in his movie titled Back to School. Sam's star was on the rise. That same year, to promote his comedy, Sam was welcomed onto the David Letterman show. David's intro for him was a light-hearted joke at the time, but in the years to come would be increasingly prophetic. His words were, "Brace yourselves, I'm not kidding, please welcome Sam Kinison." As the years went on, his shows got wilder, his screams got louder, and his shock comedy knew no bounds. Nothing was off limits. Of his 6 comedy albums that came out, the one that will most likely be considered to be his most offensive and shocking to most was his 3rd album called Have You Seen Me Lately? Much of the content on this particular album is eerily relevant to the way Sam lived and died. Much of it is just your typical sexual crudeness that is commonplace today, although it wasn't as common back then. The strange and eerie part of the album comes when he talks about religion, and how he mocks it. He talks about sexual topics in the same breath as he talks about Jesus, and then he moves on to telling people how they should drink and drive. On this album, it's clear that he has completely denounced his faith, and any type of values whatsoever. That's what makes his future so shocking. In the years to come, Sam had to hit rock bottom before he would ever start to turn his life around. Drinking, drug abuse, failed relationships, and the downfall of his career came at him like a freight train. Clubs and promoters were not returning his calls, and his fanbase began to rapidly fall. This was the cold shower that it took to wake him up, and to get him off drugs, and to get him sober. It didn't take long for Sam to have a new lease on life, and his career was back on path. During this time, 2 great things happened to Sam. One was, he found his faith again, and decided that he wanted to have a relationship with God after all. He was now clean and sober, and feeling better than he had ever felt. The other thing was that he had met the love of his life, and had gotten remarried. Little did he know that as great as life was becoming, it would be over in just 6 short days. After not even having been married a full week, Sam was driving his Pontiac Trans Am on April 10, 1992, just a few miles outside of Needles, California, when Sam was struck head-on by a 17-year-old drunk driver named Troy Pearson. The intoxicated Pearson was trying to pass another car, and had went into Sam's lane, and hit him head-on. Kinison and his wife were on their way to Laughlin, Nevada to perform at a sold-out show. Sam's brother Bill, who had been following Sam's car, came upon the accident, and found Sam unconscious between the seats of his Trans Am. After waking up, Sam was pulled from the car where his wife was still strapped in, and also unconscious. It was said that at first, Sam seemed like he was going to be fine, but then sat down on the side of the highway, and laid back down. Witnesses claimed that he was calm and started having a conversation with the sky. As he looked up, it was as if he was having a talk with someone, but no one was there. He said, "But I don't want to die." It looked as if he was listening to someone else talk to him, and then he said, "Okay," and soon after another soft, "Okay," and then he simply closed his eyes and passed away, right there on the side of the highway. Kind of spooky when you think about the content on the "Have You Seen Me Lately" album. It's good to know that he had turned his life around and sought forgiveness afterward though. His good friend, Ozzy Osbourne, was even reported as having said, "Apparently when Sam had the accident, I heard he got out of the car and looked up to the heavens and said, 'I don't want to die,' and then just said, 'Oh, okay,' and laid down and died." It sounds crazy and will probably offend a lot of my fans, but I believe there's a higher power. Some people may think Sam Kinison's in one place, but I know where he is. He's upstairs, he's next to God. Pearson, the drunk driver who had been the one responsible for Sam's death, pled guilty to 1 count of vehicular manslaughter with gross negligence. He was sentenced to 1 year of probation and 300 hours of community service. Pearson also had his driver's license suspended for 2 years in connection with the collision. Sam Kinison's body was buried in a family grave plot at Memorial Park Cemetery in Tulsa, Oklahoma. His gravestone is inscribed with the unattributed quote, "In another time and place he would have been called prophet." He was just 38 years old at his time of death. Rest in peace, Sam.